Welcome to the recording of Dynasty, where the music was disco, the drummer was a hired gun, and the deception changed the band forever. We are peeling back the glossy veneer of the Dynasty cover to reveal the calculated machinery grinding beneath. While the world saw a band returning to form, the reality was a boardroom takeover, and the man at the head of the table wasn't a musician anymore. He was the CEO of a crumbling empire, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. To understand why the Dynasty sessions became a crime scene of authenticity, we have to set the stage properly. The year is 1979. KISS is not just a band. They are a walking, breathing corporation. They are coming off the massive marketing blitz of the 1978 solo albums and the NBC movie KISS meets The Phantom of the Park. Financially, they are titans. But internally, they are rotting. They tried to sell us a simple story. The solo albums were supposed to be a vacation, a chance for everyone to blow off some creative steam. But let's be real, those 4 albums didn't clear the air. They drew battle lines. The solo albums were supposed to give the members breathing room to prevent a breakup. Instead, they just highlighted how far apart they had drifted. And honestly, they bruised the ego of the one man who believed he was the architect of KISS, Gene Simmons. In this chapter, we are dissecting Gene Simmons' role in the Dynasty era. We aren't just talking about bass lines here, we are talking about the death of a brotherhood. We're looking at how the God of Thunder transformed into a pragmatic businessman who looked at his bandmates and saw liabilities instead of brothers. He didn't just watch the band fall apart, he engineered a new version of it, one where loyalty was secondary to the bottom line. It's a tragedy of success, where the dream of rock and roll fame collides with the cold, hard reality of maintaining a franchise. The friction of the Dynasty era actually starts before a single note was recorded at Electric Lady Studios. It begins with the charts, and more importantly, with human pride. When those 4 solo albums dropped in September 1978, the internal expectation was crystal clear. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were the leaders. They were the songwriters. They were the stars. But the public? They didn't get the memo. Ace Frehley, the guy often treated as the unreliable, marginalised lead guitarist, scored the only true hit with New York Groove. It climbed all the way to number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100. His album was the critical darling. Meanwhile, Gene's album, which featured choirs and a cover of When You Wish Upon a Star, left a lot of people scratching their heads. It was a humiliating blow. For a control freak like Gene Simmons, this was a massive wake-up call. It signaled a shift in the power dynamic that he just could not handle. Imagine the sting of it. The drunk guitarist, the one you constantly have to babysit, is suddenly the one carrying the band's musical credibility. Going into Dynasty, you can see Gene's mindset shift from creative collaboration to full-on damage control. He realised that if this massive ship was going to stay afloat, he couldn't rely on the magic of the original lineup anymore. He needed insurance. This is really where the demon persona begins to detach from the man. On stage, sure, he was breathing fire, but in the studio, he was cold, calculated and dismissive. He viewed Ace's solo success not as a victory for the band, but as a fluke that threatened the hierarchy he had built. So, Gene aligned himself tightly with Paul Stanley. They formed a united front, basically a management team within the band. They decided that the democratic experiment of the solo albums was over. Dynasty would be run like a military operation. And in this operation, there was no room for soldiers who couldn't march in time. This new philosophy would claim its first casualty almost immediately. And it happened in the most brutal way possible. If the solo albums were the setup, the drumming on Dynasty was the punchline. Let's look at the facts. Peter Criss was in bad shape. He had been in a serious car accident in 1978 that injured his hands. Plus, he was dealing with significant substance abuse issues. There was a massive disconnect. In the past, a band of brothers might have worked through it. They might have taken the time to heal. But Gene Simmons was done waiting. The decision to replace Peter Criss on the Dynasty sessions is often framed as a band decision. But let's look closer at the power dynamics. It was Gene and Paul who brought in Vinnie Poncia to produce. Now, here is the twist. Vinnie Poncia had actually produced Peter's solo album. Peter trusted him, but Poncia was a pop producer who valued precision over feel, and he quickly sided with Gene and Paul. He became the perfect hatchet man for what Gene wanted to do. Gene didn't fire Peter to his face. That's not how the Dynasty power plays worked. Instead, they marginalised him. They created an environment where Peter was technically in the band, but professionally obsolete. They brought in Anton Fig, a session drummer who had played on Ace's solo album. Fig was sharp, precise, and most importantly, he did exactly what he was told. He was the perfect employee. While Peter sat in the lobby or stayed home nursing his injuries and his ego, Anton Fig was in the studio laying down the tracks that millions of fans would assume were played by the Catman. Gene Simmons allowed the lie to persist. Peter Criss appears on the cover. He is in the music videos. He toured the record. But on the vinyl spinning on your turntable, the Catman is absent on almost every track. This was Gene's ultimate power play, the preservation of the brand over the band. He understood that the fans bought the image of the four characters. As long as the makeup was right, the man behind the mask was interchangeable. This decision set a precedent that would define KISS for the next 40 years. It was the moment Gene Simmons decided that KISS was a franchise and the members were just franchisees. The only concession? They let Peter sing and play on his own song, Dirty Livin'. It was a consolation prize, a bone thrown to a starving dog to keep him quiet while the masters ate at the table. So Peter was out. But what about Ace? Ace Frehley was riding high. He had the leverage. He had the hit. But Gene Simmons is a master of attrition. He knew that Ace's lifestyle was his Achilles heel. During the Dynasty sessions, Ace was often absent. Stories from the studio tell us he would skip sessions to play cards, or because he simply didn't want to be in the same room as Gene and Paul. A different leader might have tried to bridge that gap. Gene used it as ammunition. You can see this tension spill out into the public view perfectly in the infamous Tom Snyder interview from October 31st, 1979. It's painful to watch. Ace is visibly intoxicated, telling Tom Snyder he's a plumber, grabbing a teddy bear and cackling with a loose, chaotic energy. He's treating the interview like a joke, because to him, the band had become a joke. But look at Gene. He isn't laughing. He looks like a man watching his house burn down. There is a profound sadness and a simmering rage in his eyes. He looks like a disappointed father sitting next to a drunk uncle at a funeral. He's annoyed, he's stiff, and you can practically see the gears turning in his head. He is realizing right there on national television that he cannot control Ace Frehley. Ace's humor was a defense mechanism. Gene's silence was a verdict. Back in the studio, Gene dealt with this by focusing on his own contributions with a tunnel vision that excluded the spaceman. Tracks like Charisma and X-Ray Eyes are classic Gene Simmons, plodding, heavy, egocentric. But notice the production. They are polished, they are clean, they lack the raw, dangerous edge of the early records. Why? Because Gene wasn't jamming with Ace Frehley. He was constructing songs with session musicians and a producer who wanted radio hits. Gene viewed Ace's desire for a harder rock sound as limiting. In interviews from this era, you can hear the condescension. Gene speaks of growth and maturity, but in the language of 1979, KISS, maturity meant commercial compliance. He effectively isolated Ace. By bringing in session players and controlling the production schedule with Paul, Gene ensured that even though Ace had 3 songs on the album, including a cover of 2000 Man, he had zero control over the album's overall direction. Ace was a passenger in a car he helped build, and Gene was driving it straight toward a disco club. And that brings us to the sound, the elephant in the room, the disco beat. I Was Made for Lovin' You is primarily a Paul Stanley creation, co-written with Desmond Child. But do not think for a second that Gene Simmons was a passive observer. Gene Simmons has always been driven by one thing: relevance. In 1979, rock was struggling. Disco was king. Gene's power play here was his endorsement of the shift. A purist would have fought it. A rocker would have screamed. Gene Simmons? He looked at the Billboard charts, he looked at the bank accounts, and he signed off on the synthesizer. He later admitted it was a mistake. He later claimed it eroded their rock identity. But at the moment, in the heat of the Dynasty sessions, Gene was the pragmatic businessman chasing the trend. He was willing to dilute the sonic trademark of the band if it meant keeping the corporation profitable. He traded the dangerous reputation of the demon for a spot on the dance floor. It was a calculated risk. And while it worked commercially, the song was a massive hit. It broke the trust of the core fan base. It was the final signal that the band led by Gene Simmons was now a product first and art second. The Dynasty era wasn't just a change in musical direction. It was a hostile takeover. Gene Simmons, threatened by the fracturing dynamic and Ace's rising star, consolidated power. He replaced a founding member with a ghost, marginalized the other, and chased a pop trend to secure the bottom line. He saved the business, but he killed the band. The Dynasty cover shows 4 united superheroes. But now you know the truth. It was a collage of broken relationships held together by contracts and greed. If you think the betrayal ended here, you are mistaken. The cracks in the foundation were about to bring the whole house down. In the next chapter, we look at Unmasked, where the charade finally fell apart completely. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss chapter 4. And tell me in the comments, when you watch that Tom Snyder interview, do you see a funny drunk guy, or do you see a band falling apart in real time? I'll see you in the comments.